on this episode of AK Podcast.
We typically have said that feeding calves is a bit more of an art than a science. And similar to you, I go back to my childhood. It was okay, well, what temperature should the milk be? Put it on your wrist, and as long as it doesn't burn you, you're good to go. And how much water do you add? Well, get it to the bottom of the A on the Ace Hardware sign on the bucket and call it good, sort of thing. But one thing is that a couple things we know is that the science for specifically pre-weaned calves or wet calves, going to use that term kind of interchangeably, but really we're talking about that period where they're still on milk, which is typically going to be 60 to 70 days for a calf. The amount of science and the amount of resources that have been dedicated to that period has really ramped up in the last 10 years.
You know you're a hay nerd when you walk into a hay barn and you just love that smell.
Doggone it, I gotta put more corn in. I'm gonna have to add some soybean meal. Wow, did that cost you a lot of money?
Put yourself in a crowded elevator, and the elevator stops because, I don't know, the building's on fire.
I really like to ask them what's important to them.
We're here for the cow. She's giving us all the profits we need to maintain these facilities and buildings and employees. Man, let's take care of her.
Roadway, I'd call it more as a roundabout.
And it's kind of like a weird analogy where we're, as farmers, farming and raising these livestock up, and then themselves are kind of have their own, herd of microbes in their gut that they're raising up.
I have two great passions in my life. The one is people, and the second is cows. And I want to get the best out of them.
Welcome to AK Podcast, where we discuss science and nutrition behind livestock care and management with the best and the brightest in the business. I'm your host, Chris Radke, part of the sales department here at Agri-King. And with me today is the director of field services and a member of the sales management team, Mr. Mike Donaldson. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Very well, Chris. How's everything working in your world as we get close to Thanksgiving?
Wonderful. I think you said this before, but Thanksgiving is definitely one of my favorite holidays. So we are super excited. My kids are getting to the point where school's winding down. So they're excited for a little break. So how about yourself, buddy?
Really good. Really good. Sort of getting into that whole holiday vibe. I snuck the Christmas lights out, but we won't light them till next week. But I got all the ladder work done before it got icy.
Yeah, that's always a good move. Okay. All right, Mike, who's with us and what are we talking about today?
Well, Chris, today is going to be part 2 of the series we have on calves and heifers. We're joined again by Agri-King nutrition consultant, Dr. Adam Geiger. Adam, welcome back to the AK Podcast. For those of you who maybe haven't seen part 1 yet, could you give some background on yourself and some of the things that led you to have this passion, not only for dairy in general, but specifically calves?
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. Glad to be back for round 2. Yeah. I mean, I grew up on a dairy. I've been around cattle my whole life. The typical Wisconsin dairy kid, right just south of Lambeau Field was where our farm was at, and all of our milk went to cheese production. But I've been working with calves and heifers now for a number of years. It started with really my master's and PhD both had pretty heavy calf research focuses, a lot based on how we feed those babies to make them better producing cows down the road. And then everything I've done prior to joining Agri-King has been extremely calf focused, both within the U.S. and outside the U.S. So I've been blessed to see a lot of things go right, a lot of things not go so right, but ultimately see how much of a difference we can make in these animals with some small and maybe what seem like minor changes that we make on an operation really carrying through and having massive impacts for these animals. And it's really become a really big passion of mine, seeing how we can make those changes and have that positive impact.
Well, and as proof of his international influence, while Chris was setting this all up, Adam was regaling me with stories about just getting back from Japan and stories about Wagyu calves that I'd never imagined were a challenge, but that's probably a whole nother podcast. We'll get into his overseas exploits another day. In part 1, we dealt primarily with the time from before a calf's born, a little bit before they're born, to all those SOPs we want to make sure we get right in the first hours of that calf's life. So today we're going to pick up from that point and go through that time, take them from being wet calves up until we're getting close to weaning, but we are going to stop short of weaning today. So, Adam, why don't you jump in? Let's take that hypothetical calf that we got off to such a good start in our first 20 to 30 hours, and what comes next for her?
Well, before we completely dive into that, there are two things from part one that do carry over into this phase. And so, if you haven't watched part one, please do. But the first thing is again, we're going to be, as we get past the first 24 to 48 hours, we are still going to be needing to check that animal for signs of naval infection. So we spent a lot of time last time talking about, assessing calves for naval infection. You're going to need to continue to do that over the first week or two. I recommend two checks after that initial dipping, and if you feel any sign of heat or inflammation, redip again and consult with your veterinarian about how to treat that. Um, and the other thing that carries through, and now you really need to watch part one, is this sanitation thing. We talked really heavily about sanitizing colostrum feeding equipment. That doesn't end after colostrum. So one thing we need to really make sure we're doing is we're going to be switching these calves from colostrum. There might be some farms that have a transition milk protocol where they're feeding kind of that heavier, higher fat, higher protein, still has some of the goodies in it from colostrum. They might be feeding that for a few days. But regardless of whether they're incorporating that feed or not, they're then going to transition to either whole milk from the farm or a milk replacer product. And the equipment we use to feed that, sanitation still is paramount. So all of those checks when I did that demonstration last time with the bacteria meter, I'm going to be using that on the calf feeding equipment too. So we don't get a break on cleaning just because they're no longer on colostrum. So before we really dive in, I just wanted to make sure to highlight those that, hey, check that navel, and we got to continue to sanitize and make that a focus for that baby calf.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think that often one of the things that I can't remember if I said this last time, and 60 years ago, this was the case with me. It seems like sometimes feeding calves winds up the job of either kids or maybe not the most qualified people because it's relatively light work. It doesn't take a great deal of strength to feed a calf. And I didn't do a bad job, but I certainly wasn't paying attention to things the way you're outlining. They really ought to be taken care of. And I think these are the things that often slip through the cracks, and all of a sudden you've got a full scale disaster on your hands.
And we typically have said that feeding calves is a bit more of an art than a science. And similar to you, I go back to my childhood. It was okay, well, what temperature should the milk be? Put it on your wrist, and as long as it doesn't burn you, you're good to go. And how much water do you add? Well, get it to the bottom of the A on the Ace Hardware sign on the bucket and call it good, sort of thing. But one thing is that a couple things we know is that the science for specifically pre-weaned calves or wet calves, going to use that term kind of interchangeably, but really we're talking about that period where they're still on milk, which is typically going to be 60 to 70 days for a calf. The amount of science and the amount of resources that have been dedicated to that period has really ramped up in the last 10 years. We may say still it's more of an art than a science, but the science is pretty dialed in now. We know a heck of a lot about what that calf needs, how it needs it, and how to do it. But perhaps the most key phrase I can use for calves, especially wet calves, is calves crave consistency, right? So when we're talking about feeding calves, for us, it's all about being as consistent as possible. right? And that's consistent with feeding times, right? Predominantly, the majority of folks out there are probably feeding twice a day, right? We need to keep those feedings as close to 12 hours apart as possible. Now, that may not sound very convenient, right? And I say that there's a number of farms that are feeding 3 times a day. There's a number of farms that are using automatic calf feeders, so those calves are eating a number of times a day. But for our 2 times a day feeders, which is still the majority out there, think about a place like where you guys live or where I grew up in Wisconsin. Can you imagine if you fed that calf at say 5 or 6 a.m. and then you wanted to end your day early? And so you maybe feed at 2 or 3. So now instead of even 12-hour splits between feeding, maybe you've got 15 or 16 hours between that evening and that morning feeding, and it gets down to negative 20 degrees at night. How's that calf doing come 4 or 5 in the morning, right? You've put a huge strain and a huge stressor on that calf by not being consistent with your feeding times.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, these calves crave consistency in terms of milk temperature, right? We need to be really focused on that calf's body temperature, which is going to be around 101.5 Fahrenheit, right? And so we need to make sure that we're feeding that milk pretty close to the calf's body temperature, right? And so the temperature for that first calf and that last calf we feed should be very, very similar, if not the same, as close to the same as possible, right? So that means that we need to make sure that we're delivering in the milk in a way that's temperature consistent. But that also then means if we're mixing milk replacer, for example, we have to be really careful about the temperature we do that at. If we need to feed it close to calf's body temperature, you're probably talking about mixing at 105 to 110 degrees, maybe a little bit higher during the winter months. But we shouldn't be mixing our milk up at 140, 150 degrees, because if we're doing that, it's going to be way too hot when we give it to the calf. And also, you start to actually denature proteins around 150 to 160 degrees. So you're actually going to start to destroy the product that you're feeding these calves. I'm going to stop there because I've got more to say, but it looks like your gears may be turning a little bit. I don't want to go too wild on you.
Well, yeah, because I think, and I'm in my mind, I'm envisioning the farms I'm on that have a 30-foot rack of bottles, and the farms I'm on that have 2 buckets with 2 bottles in each bucket going out to 4 calf hutches. So,
Yeah,
and I never really thought of the difference between those realities, and yet the calf doesn't care if she's 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 4,000. And
exactly.
I mean, so, and maybe you're about to jump into this. What then becomes the protocol for that calf feeder to get that something as simple as a consistent temperature to get that accomplished? What are some of the things that you put in place to make sure that happens?
Yeah, that's going to be really dependent on the size of the operation and the approach. We may have to mix smaller batches during winter. We may need to provide insulated insulation around our tank or our milk transporter. We may just have to make more trips back and forth from the mixing location. So that's really going to depend on the operation and their current protocols and their mode of delivery. But when we talk about consistency, the by far the most important thing for consistency is the dry matter or the solids content of the milk, right? So just a small change in dry matter or solids consistency from feeding to feeding can cause calves to scour. All right. So when we're talking about milk replacer, I'm typically recommending 13.5 to 14% solids with my guys. Right. And, I have some guys that might argue with me and try to increase it to 15% or something like that during winter. More on that later. But we really need to make sure, ideally, that we're weighing out both the water and the powder. I used to work for a milk replacer company. I know that aside from just the powder in that bag, there's also a cup, right? And some
Right.
milk replacer companies have gotten rid of the cup, which I love. But
Okay.
the cup was designed for us, not for the calf, right? And it's funny, we talk about consistency and the fact that I was just in Japan, right? And how consistent we need to be, right? This guy was using a cup to measure out um, his milk replacer, and I said, how many cups do you give a calf a day? He goes, one heaping cup. So he wasn't even making it level, right? And I said, well, that heap, that's not very consistent. He said, "Oh, no, I'm a consistent heaper." And I said, "Okay, prove it." So we pulled out the gram scale, and one heap versus the other, we were off by like 100 grams, right? So weigh it, weigh the water, weigh the milk, right? Those small differences really can make a huge difference to the calf in terms of health and things like that. And our whole milk feeders, they're not immune from this either. Because think about that whole milk that we feed on farm. A lot of times it's treated milk or it's kind of our discarded milk. So you might be using a bunch of fresh cow milk one day. The next day you might be using a bunch of treated milk. I hope we're not doing too good of a job of creating treated milk or waste milk on farm. Another topic for another day. But that solids consistency is going to vary considerably from feeding to feeding and day to day as well. And so we're not immune in those situations either.
Going back slightly, but if I don't ask you now, I'll forget. So you're a good stalwart Midwest boy, south of Green Bay. You talked about that. You work all over the world. You live in Georgia. Is it at least a little bit inherently easier to be consistent with baby calves in a climate like you live in now, not the one you were raised in, where you have those wild swings in temperature going cold? Or is the challenge of calves having to spend a lot of time over 100 degrees a bigger challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. So calves struggle with the cold, right? Their thermal neutral zone is much tighter and higher than a cow. So they're going to be impacted at lower temperatures more readily, more quickly than an adult animal will, because number one, they don't have a functioning rumen yet. So they don't have that internal heater that an adult cow has. Number two, they have a greater surface area relative to body size, right? So they just lose a lot more heat, right? So those are the things really to keep in mind. But, you know, calves struggle with heat as well. But what I'll say is, and I actually have a couple grants I'm working with on some universities right now where we're looking at heat stressing calves because we don't really know how much heat impacts the calf's nutrient requirements. We know it impacts it negatively, but we don't really truly know to what degree. So we know that's impactful, and we need to cool those calves, provide air movement during summer. But we definitely know that during winter, there's a couple things that we need to be doing. Number one, we need to make sure that we're providing ample amounts of bedding and that bedding is dry, right? We still do need to have some air movement during winter just to keep the air clean, because if the air contamination gets high, and we typically measure that on farm using ammonia strips, if that air contamination load gets kind of high, those calves can still develop respiratory disease in winter. But we need to really just kind of clean the air and not provide a draft on the calf. So if you think during summer, we probably need to change the air in the calves area, once every minute, right? We're providing about 60 air changes per hour. In winter, we only need to provide about 4, right? So we're just changing the air about every 15 minutes just to keep it clean. And air quality is a whole nother topic, but we need to provide good, clean, ample amounts of bedding. And the other thing we need to do is realize that the calf's nutrient requirements are increasing during winter. So we do need to provide more nutrition to them if we want to keep their gain consistent with the gain we see in spring and fall and summer. But going back to something I mentioned earlier, a lot of times what guys want to do is they want to add more powder to the same amount of water, right? Take our solids from 13 or 14 up to 15 or 16, right? To give those calves a more stout meal. I don't recommend doing that because when you change that solids, now you're going to increase the risk of diarrhea. And so you're trying to help that calf by providing more nutrients, but now it's got to use more nutrients to deal with scours, right? So what I recommend you do instead is either provide an extra feeding for those calves during those cold temperatures, or provide an extra quart or two, maybe an extra quart in the morning, extra quart in the evening of the same concentration solution, right? So keep it at that 13 to 14%, and then just provide them with an extra quart just to help them have enough energy to deal with that colder temperature.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question.
No, and for those of you who have not watched enough of these podcasts, we don't really figure out much ahead of time. The whole conversation and don't quite know where we're going to go is pretty much the standard. So, no, that was not a. It might have been a bad question, but that was a good answer. So, so going back to where you were, we're talking about getting these things done consistently. Keep expanding on that idea, how we want to take care of these babies.
Yeah, so I think in terms of consistency, we've already hit on a few things. We've hit on consistency of the liquid diet, right? And we started to hit on consistency of the environment and consistency of sanitation and cleaning. If we want to kind of finish that concept around consistency of the liquid diet, we will finish that, and then we'll kind of head to consistency of environment and consistency of solid feed. But when you talk about the liquid diet, keeping the bacteria level low and having consistent cleaning protocols is very important. The temperature, the solids, and then it's really just consistency of nutrient delivery. And when I say that, what I'm meaning is, you know, we struggle with this a lot more with whole milk a lot of times than we do with milk replacer, right? A milk replacer is going to have a very consistent protein level, a very consistent fat level, and then you only have two other components, your ash content, which is your vitamins and minerals, and then your lactose content. Take that over to whole milk. Then let's ignore the fact that we may be using waste milk or treated milk in these calves. If you just talk about whole milk in general, things are kind of turned on their head with whole milk, right? We know a calf is going to have its most efficient growth when the protein to energy ratio is a 1.4 to 1. So if you look at a milk replacer, that would be like a 28 protein, 20 fat. Okay. There's a lot of 26-20s out there, 24-20s, because protein's obviously very expensive. And then you also have the lactose fraction contributing to energy. So a 28-20 was just kind of a ballpark estimate. But if you dried down whole milk and made it a milk replacer, just removed all the moisture from it, you probably have a 27-30, right? A 27 protein, 30 fat, because there's so much more fat in whole milk. Right?
I never even
So
thought
now
of that, but yeah, that's just math. I never even thought of
Yeah.
it, but that's a huge difference.
Yeah. So you have an inverse protein to fat ratio, right? So in winter, that's going to be great, right? They're going to use a lot of that for keeping themselves warm and things like that, so those increased nutrient requirements. But you are no longer growing very efficiently when you're feeding whole milk. And the more of it you feed, the bigger that gap becomes, because then lactose is going to start to become a bigger contributor as well, as we start to feed more. The other thing we need to remember with whole milk is based off the NASEM or the NRC requirements for gain and performance, whole milk is actually deficient in vitamin D and E. It's deficient in 5B vitamins, and it's deficient in our major trace minerals, right? So now we're feeding a feed that, again, we tend to think, well, Mother Nature must be perfect because of that's how nature designed the feed and everything. But really, if we want to optimize gain and efficiency of gain, that's when we're feeding whole milk, that's really when we need to start looking at potentially adding something to it, like a high protein booster to try to at least get that protein to energy ratio up over 1 to promote more of this gain instead of more of this gain, right? And then getting some of those extra vitamins and trace minerals in there that those calves are going to need to stay healthy and meet their requirements there. So milk replacer does a very good job of being consistent as long as we mix it well. Certainly, it's a cost, right? But if you're feeding saleable milk, there's a cost associated with that too, and there's certainly a cost if you're feeding waste milk and your calves aren't performing as well as they could have.
Well, and you alluded to it. The other aspect is waste milk itself by name is wasted. I mean, the cost of not being able to sell it is significant.
Yep. I've got a lot of farms that tell me they're really good at making waste milk. But I don't like to see that. That's a whole nother conversation.
So, any other thoughts on the liquid portion? Because I think the next one, when we start talking about solids, now you're going to really run into old school, new school. I mean, that seems to be a lively conversation, but I don't want to give short shrift to the liquid aspect.
No, I think when you start talking about liquid, it's never just the liquid, right? You're balancing the liquid and the solid, right? And so we'll head to solid. We can end with the environment kind of last. I touched on it a little bit, but really it's a balancing act, right? When it comes to liquid and solid, right? Because that calf's not going to eat any solid feed for the first 2 or 3 weeks, right? It's going to be on milk. It's born not a functioning ruminant, right? So if you look at a picture of the stomach, it's mostly abomasum. That's where milk digestion occurs. Um, and then by the time this calf's weaned, we're trying to get it to be mostly rumen, right? And if you look at Mother Nature and our beef calves, that process happens in 6 months, right? If you look at dairy calves, we try to do it in 60 days, right? So I would argue this is perhaps one of the biggest physiological changes we ever ask an animal to go through. And it's certainly extremely stressful. So that's where balancing liquid and solid feed becomes really important. And this is an area of research that I've dedicated a lot of my life to. And this at universities is probably 2 separate 1-hour lectures, and we're going to try to cram it in here to a few minutes. So forgive me if I'm maybe not going wildly into detail on some of these things, but there's this trend globally to feed more milk, right? If you look maybe 10 years ago, we were feeding 1 pound to 1.25 pounds of milk powder a day. That number has increased. In some situations, it's doubled or more, right? And certainly the adoption of automatic calf feeders has really helped with that as well, because it's a little more hands off, at least in terms of the feeding. But we're feeding more milk. And the big reason for that is that a lot of research, including my own PhD research, has shown that the faster calves grow in the first 60 days, 60 to 90 days, the more milk they produce in first lactation. Well, what's the easiest way to get more growth? Put more milk in them, right? Growth on milk is very efficient, right? It's an easy way for us to add average daily gain, right? But the more milk we feed, the more we start to forsake the grain. So that's where next time we'll talk about, hey, as we're feeding more milk, and we have to design good weaning programs to account for that, right? But we need to make sure that we have a very palatable grain to pair with that milk program. We need to make sure that we are offering that that grain and water free choice from day one. Because those calves aren't going to start eating or drinking water, eating feed or drinking water on day one, but we need them to get familiar with it. And water and grain, you can't uncouple them. They go hand in hand. And it's a 4-to-1 relationship. For every 1 pound of feed a calf is going to eat, dry feed, she will consume 4 pounds of water. So if you're not providing enough water, you are not going to get enough grain intake. Now, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you get you make me think. You get me excited about stuff. So would I be right in guessing that offering enough water is one of the more common shortcomings you stumble across on a farm? Then
That and the quality of the water,
okay.
right? Calves, calves are very susceptible to poor quality water. Well, and then of course during winter the water bucket's freezing, right? So that's another whole fun thing that we have to manage and take control of. But if things are not right with your calves in terms of growth and you feel like you're doing things right and they're still loose, things like that, test the water, right? And this, you might even be seeing it problems in your older heifers or adult cattle. And I always say, calves are the canary in the mine shaft when it comes to water. If
Mhm.
you make a change to water, treat your water, bring in a different water source, the calves will show you within a week or two if that makes a difference. You'll see it in their fecal consistency, their hair coats, things like that. But providing, yeah, enough free choice water with with making sure it's clean and good quality is definitely a major shortcoming that I see around the world with calves.
Okay.
Yeah, and you need that water to get them to consume the feed, right? And so the first question I get asked is, okay, what's better, a texturized starter or a complete pellet? You know, I would say naturally I work with texturized starters a little bit more, personal preference, but both can work extremely well. There's really no difference. What it comes down to is processing, right? Can we get a good pellet? Because calves don't like fine particles. So if we have a pellet that's coming apart, breaking apart, and it's resulting in a lot of powder in the bottom of the bucket, that's going to be a problem. But if we have a good quality pellet, and you can run into the same powder issues with processed corn, for example, too, right? In a texturized starter. So it all comes down to processing, making sure that we have access to something that's not going to result in fine particles, because that's going to ultimately lead to digestive upsets in calves. Um, and then it comes down to formulating that starter appropriately. Uh, Without getting too deep in the weeds, globally, we have seen a trend, I'd say, in the last 5 years for really putting a lot of starch in our calf starters. I've seen 40%. I just analyzed 2 calf starters last week that were over 40% starch. You can see them higher than that, right? Well,
Really? Hmm.
this becomes a problem, especially as we get closer to weaning, and we start to see grain intake ramp up. Right? When that grain intake ramps up and there's a ton of starch there, you're going to see a lot of acidosis in these calves. You're going to see a lot of fecal inconsistency from calf to calf, and you're going to see potentially even bubbly mucus or bubbly mucusy manure from that rapid increase in grain as they're getting bigger, combined with then that depression in ruminal pH, right? So we need to remember that calves have a requirement for fiber. So we do need to be making sure that we are providing enough fiber to these calves. But one of the bigger mistakes we make on farm is we just provide them some free choice forage along with a high starch uh, concentrate. Now, I'm not saying forage is bad for calves. I think calves have a fiber and a forage requirement, but really I want to see that provided as a complete mix. Because what happens if you have a high starch concentrate and free choice forage? They're going to go eat that concentrate, they're going to get acidosis, they're going to go eat the forage to help buffer the rumen and bring that pH back up. Now they're feeling good again. So what are they going to do? They're going to go back to the high starch, and then they don't feel good again. And it's just this back and forth, and it just really is going to depress gain and make this whole weaning transition that we're ultimately going to get to all the more stressful and all the more problematic.
So when you talk okay, the aspect of raising the starch like that, if it's not a good thing, what is the good intention gone wrong that's leading people to do that? That faster growth again? What's the cheapness of a feed? What is it?
It comes down to rumen development. Rumen development is determined by grain by readily fermentable carbohydrates in the calf's developing rumen, right? Fiber doesn't really develop the rumen. It develops the musculature around the rumen, but there's some great work done at Penn State that if you look at calves reared on just milk, milk and grain, milk and hay, the only calves that experience rumen development are the calves that were on milk and grain. The calves that are on milk and hay, their stomach looked the exact same as a calf that was reared on milk only. So the data out there shows we need to get 15 kgs or 35 pounds of NFC intake in a calf. Once we get that, the calf's rumen is fully developed. So in theory, if you up the starch, up the grain, the cereal grain or the corn inclusion in the calf starter, we could hit that 15 kgs or 35 pounds quicker and wean them quicker. But it's kind of counterproductive, right? So I think the intentions were good, trying to get enough fermentable carbohydrates in there. But calves are susceptible to acidosis too. So it's one of those too much of a good thing kind of approaches, right?
Yep. Too much ether in a
Does that make
diesel
sense?
engine. Oh, absolutely.
That's right.
Just yeah, too much ether in a diesel engine on a cold day. Okay. Like I say, that's interesting. I never really thought of that aspect of how we see it in cows, especially not fed a TMR, and they have corn silage and a round bale feeder. And back in the day, I worked with enough places that did that. And even if average was fine, they hit average with one hoof on boiling water and one on ice because and on any given day, half of them were acidotic and eating too much hay, and the other half were feeling good enough to go hog down on the corn silage. And we took that choice away from them, and in essence, you're saying we need to take it away from the calves.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's other nuances here. And again, we could spend all day on it, right? That make this even more complicated. When you feed more milk, calves naturally will slug feed more, right? And so their feeding bouts are depressed, but they can become a lot more unpredictable, right? Similarly, as we're seeing a lot of people push these automatic calf feeders, there's a lot of people that are pushing to group housing, sometimes on automatic calf feeders, sometimes on mob feeders or rail feeders, things like that. And then you start to deal with dominance issues, right? And so that gets back to your conversation you just had about averages, right? You say, well, on average, these calves are eating 3 pounds a day. Well, you look out there, one calf is 8 inches taller than the other one. It's like, well, yeah, the law of averages isn't always your friend. That calf's maybe getting a little bit more than 3, and that puny guy in the corner is getting a pound, and then those calves are really going to struggle as the milk starts to go away through the weaning process.
Interesting. Before we jump into anything with environment, anything more on the diet side we want to talk about?
Yeah, I think a couple points I would make is I've noticed as I go around the world talking about some of this stuff is, you talk about fiber versus forage. People tend to get confused, right? The calf has a fiber requirement. Forage is one way to get there, right? You can also incorporate things such as cottonseed hulls, soy hulls. There's a variety of other things that can help us get bulk into the diet to help meet this calf's fiber requirement. If we have a high starch concentrate, we can mix finely chopped hay in there. It doesn't need to be a very high chop length, 1 or 2 inches mixed in. And a lot of times, if I've got guys that are struggling, we'll mix it in at 5 to 10% inclusion rate into that concentrate, and that can really help those calves with those higher starch feeds. And then we start to talk about carb source, right? And there's a lot of options out there. Corn is by far the most common. Processed corn, flaked corn is really, really popular. I've got some folks that use whole corn. Whole corn can do a very good job too, especially if where you get your processed corn, it's got a lot of fines and they can't process it. Calves like wheat. Wheat can be a good option. Oats Calves like oats, and it provides a little bit of bulk to your ration too, which is really nice. The one that we do need to be a little bit careful of, though, is barley, right? Barley is extremely fermentable, right? So if we're talking about acidosis and scours and things like that, we just need to be careful with our barley inclusion, right? Because calves love it. It's our most rapidly fermentable grain source, and so if not managed correctly, it can cause some issues as well.
Okay. Okay. Well, moving into the environmental part, what do we want to be paying attention to there?
Yeah. So for me, managing the environment, I always look at it in terms of airborne ammonia. I've got these little strips. I don't have them on me right now because it wouldn't look very cool because there's hopefully no ammonia in my office. But we're measuring airborne ammonia on farm because airborne ammonia is a very good indicator of airborne bacterial load, right? Our rule of thumb is we need airborne ammonia to be less than 5 parts per million ammonia in the air. When ammonia exceeds 5, we're going to lose feed efficiency. When it exceeds 10, we're going to lose average daily gain and our risk of respiratory disease doubles. Okay. So that's kind of our proxy, right? And a high airborne ammonia can be an indicator of either improper air movement. Remember, we need to get a certain amount of wind speed through there during summer and during winter to keep the environment clean. But it could be, and typically is more of an indicator of improper bedding management. And this becomes a bigger deal in post-wean calves, which we'll talk about next time because there's a lot more fecal and urine that comes into play then. But there's work done out of the University of Wisconsin that I think is really, really awesome. They looked at calves at the same airborne contamination levels. And all they did was provide more dry, clean bedding. Okay. And so we're talking about we score bedding on a scale from 1 to 3. It's called a nesting score. A 1 would be like just shavings. A 3 would be deep, dry straw, so the calf beds down, and when you look at the calf, you can't really see the hocks or knees, so it's kind of protected from drafts. When you go from a 1 to a 3, you reduce your risk of respiratory disease by 50%. So I say all that to say we're using ammonia to kind of help us understand the environment, but you can do more for air quality and managing the environment by just providing more dry, clean bedding than you really can through any other means. So bedding management really, and using air ammonia to kind of tell us maybe when the bedding needs to be changed, bedding management really can move the needle pretty far in terms of being consistent with that environment.
Uh, I don't like to endlessly reference my age, but it does give you perspective if you live long enough to remember things. And I remember a time when calves, you had a really well-designed tie stall barn if you had half a dozen big pens at the end of the barn that you could put your calves in. And we had all kinds of respiratory troubles. Along came calf hutches. Magic idea. And I think that kept the extension advisors in business for quite a few years, just either giving out plans or giving the name of someone who could sell you a fiberglass calf hutch. And it was an almost instant overnight, man, I don't have calf problems anymore because I put them out in hutches. And, hutches properly managed can do a very good job. And now, between especially the automated feeders and going to a group housing from that standpoint, and like we don't have enough to worry about in the dairy industry, there has started to be some social crusaders that don't like the idea that a calf is in a hutch by itself and lacks the social. And I know that even from a practical standpoint, calves really don't do as well completely walled off from all their friends. Um, in a world move that might either choose or have to move on from hutches and go to a group housing, regardless of how they're fed, you laid out those options. What do you see as the potential things that hutches have just taken care of that we're now going to have to pay closer attention to?
Well, the two biggest things are number one, hutches limit calf to calf contact if you do them right. I've seen guys that have hutches right next to each other. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. But it limits calf to calf contact. Number two is that individual observation, right? You know pretty darn quick when you put that milk out there if there's something wrong with that calf. Right. And then if you need to do something with that calf, it's pretty easy to hop in there, get a hold of it, treat it, whatever you got to do. Right. So, you have that better attention to the individual calf, I would say, to an extent. With automatic calf feeders, you have now, or group housing, you have now reintroduced calf to calf contact, right? And what I say always is when that shift happens, you are no longer employing a calf feeder. You are employing a calf manager. So your labor in that situation has now become much more specialized. They need to better understand some of the subtle signs of disease and illness. Now, if you're using an automatic calf feeder, it will take a lot of that data for you, right? You got to use it, but it's going to give you a lot of data, right? How much that calf's drinking a day, things like that. But perhaps my favorite thing that an automatic calf feeder can give you is drinking speed. A calf is going to drink 600 to 800 mils per minute. If it's not feeling good, that'll drop by 15%, right? So when you start to see that drop, you can get in, give it electrolytes, handle it, take temperature, things like that. So we'll use the data right. We can really get ahead of a lot of issues we might have with automatic calf feeders. But as that person transitions from a calf feeder to a calf manager, not every employee is going to be able to handle that well. And not every employee is fit to do that. But it goes back to one of the things we mentioned right away. You are spending a lot more time cleaning and sanitizing now, right?
Okay.
So you're going to have to spend a lot of time with those automatic calf feeders. Or if it's a mob feed or whatever it is, you're cleaning a lot more. You have to make sure things are clean, right? Because if not, it's going to be a train wreck. I see a lot of people put in these calf feeders. They have their 3 to 6 month honeymoon period. They've not put a lot of time into cleaning, and then all of a sudden, hey, they're sitting in a closet somewhere. The auto feeders or the mob feeders because they're having issues with calf health. A lot of benefits, right? You've got the social welfare aspect you mentioned. The calves love it. People love it. Personally, I think calves eat more grain in those situations because they learn from each other. There's that learned behavior aspect, which, if managed right, can lead then to better growth. So, again, a long answer to a short question, but that change has started to happen, and you see it in places like Europe. They're way further ahead of us in terms of group housing and things like that, and it prevents a lot of opportunities, but it changes the way that we have to manage things a little bit too.
It's interesting you talk about the ability, and it almost harkens back to a time of just pure, he's a good cow man. That young woman knows how to read calves. We did a training last summer at a farm, and one of the people that was at the training works with your counterpart out in California, Cameron Coburn. And I didn't think anything of it. We're looking at, I don't know how many hundred calves. And this relatively new person to Agri-King said, they're not tagging these calves right. They're getting the tag in the wrong place of the ear, and the ears aren't able to come up. You can't look at these calves and see that bright eye ears up. And when you try to explain that to a non-farm person, they look at you like you're making up a story. But when you know it, when you see it, it's as plain as the nose on your face. And I mean, one of the things I know they recommended to that farm was that they get a little bit more careful with where they place those ear tags. And I never would have thought of the impact that plays.
Yeah, the little things can make a big difference, and we'll start to dive into this more next time too, with the kind of the weaning and after. But you know, running calves out of feed where they've got to reach and push, consistent things like that can lead to lameness 2 years later in the lactating herd. So I mean, there's little things that we do, right, and that goes back to that conversation around the mammary growth and the future milk yield, right? this is, again, I'll nerd out for a second because this is my area of emphasis that I did my PhD in. But that mammary gland in the calf is completely different than any other organ in the animal's body because it doesn't exist at birth. All of the udder development happens after the calf is born. And we can positively influence it through nutrition for the first 60 to 90 days. So that means the wet calf phase and the weaning phase, essentially. That's the only time in the life of the calf that we can increase gain, because as we increase gain of the body, the mammary gland is going to follow suit. That's the only time period we can do that, right? Those first 60 to 90 days. Doing that is going to increase first lactation milk yield, right? But again, if you don't do it, then you can't make it up when they're pregnant or when they're breeding age, right? So little subtle changes, and we can do it through milk and grain, harmonizing those to get the best gains we can, try to get, over 2 pounds of gain a day. And if we can do that, though, we're going to improve first lactation milk yield, right? And it's just little things, keeping things cleaner, keeping the calves healthy, offering more milk during winter, for example. Some of these little decisions that are going to end up leading to 500 pounds per cow in first lactation or something like that, right? And so that's the struggle, though, with calves, right, is you don't always see – you can see the immediate return in some things, right, like your hutch example. But some of these things we do with feeding, you might see improved growth through weaning, things like that. But then some of these milk yield differences you're not going to see for 2 years, right? So there is a bit of a patience aspect to it as well. But the little things, as you alluded to, can make an absolutely huge difference.
Well, I think we've got this fictitious calf we're talking about kind of through the phase that we wanted to discuss today. And, we've got her up not to the point of starting the weaning process, but you can see it from here. Any other concluding thoughts on this phase that we've talked about today, Adam?
I just think this is where we start to get to the point where we think about what weaning looks like, right? And the way we've made decisions up to this point in terms of how much milk we feed, things like that, are going to dictate how we ultimately go through the weaning process. But we need to remember that the calf does not have a fully functioning rumen until she's consumed 15 kg or about 35 pounds of NFC, or essentially, if we want to just make it simple, I want to see her consuming at least 3 pounds of solid feed per day for 3 to 5 days in a row before we take the milk away. So when we are getting to the point of weaning, we shouldn't be making that decision based off age. We shouldn't be making that decision based off weight. Her feeding behavior is going to dictate when we are ready to start moving to that next phase.
Perfect. That was a great day. Appreciate everything you've discussed. Chris, I'll throw it back to you. What'd you learn today, big man?
Simple, kind of like what Adam was just wrapping us up with, but that minor changes equals large effects in our end, what we're looking for. And consistency, I guess, as you go through this podcast, Adam just kept saying consistent, everything from our times to our temperatures to everything, our environment, everything just consistently instead of changing things. Yeah. Adam, thank you so much for sharing. I love your passion and your just knowledge and just your way you just keep telling us. It's amazing. I love it. If you like what you heard or like what we talked about, you can find us on just about any socials. Please leave us a review on whatever app you're listening to. You can find us at the bottom of our website at Agri-King.com. And if you have any follow-up questions or something else you'd like us to talk about, you can email us at podcast@Agri-King.com. Adam, Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Be sure to join us for our next part. Talk to you later.